Bid everybody pleasant good morning. Good to see you. It's not raining this morning. It's like the first time in a week that we've gotten up and it's not been raining in the morning. So the sun may come out, so that'd be nice. So we can have a sauna for 3 or 4 days till everything dries up. But I'm very thankful to be here. I'm really thankful on days like today to have a building to worship in. That we're not back in the brush arbor days, because I would already be sweating. It just doesn't take much. So hope you're doing well today. Welcome those of you that are visiting. Appreciate Jack taking care of class on Wednesday night. We are looking at this first paragraph in chapter 3, and we'll pick up with a few thoughts that connect the last few passages with where we're going this morning. So if you haven't already turned there, please do so. Andrew, would you mind leading us in a prayer as we get started this morning? Amen. One of the interesting things about this particular letter, we've made the observation several times, it's very personal in nature. You really kind of get a glimpse of Paul, perhaps in ways that we don't often think of Paul. Think back a little bit. When we're first introduced to Paul, we know him by another name, Saul. And what is he doing? Persecuting the church. And so when you go back and you read Acts 8 and Acts 9, what is your kind of impression of the person that Paul was? If you were to try to boil it down in 1 or 2 words, in your mind, how do you think of Paul? Actually, Saul. Okay, zealous is very often the word that comes to mind first. Somebody else said something? Fanatical. Yeah, it's not just zeal, but he is fanatical. Does he strike you as a person that is very much concerned with what other people think? When you think about him, he's holding the coats of the people that are stoning Stephen. He is going into people's houses, dragging them out. He's gotten letters from the authorities so he can go to Damascus, as far away as Damascus, in order to find Jews that are giving themselves to this new Christian worship that's going on, and he is intense about that. He describes himself in 1 Timothy chapter 1 as an insolent man when it comes to his disposition about such things. And then you get to letters like this one. What's the primary reason? We've already talked about this, and it is where we are in the letter. What's the primary reason he's writing this letter to this group of Christians? He's worried about them. And over he keeps talking about how much they mean to him, and how much their faith, and not just their faith, but their appreciation for him, their reception of him, their affection for him, how all of those things matter to him. And it is a strange thing to me to think of Paul, because even as an apostle, I still think of Paul as zealous, almost fanatical. He's going to go in, he's going to teach you gospel. You don't like what he has to say, he's going to shake his robe at you and walk off and find somebody else to teach. And so when you get little statements like this one, letters like this one that tell us that, what does it say at the end of chapter 2? What is our hope or joy or crown of rejoicing? Even you in the presence of the Lord at his coming. You are our glory and joy. It is a part of Paul's disposition that I think we don't appreciate very much. It's just easy to think of him as, in my mind, head down, eyes forward, boots in the stirrups, riding through the storm. Doesn't matter what anybody thinks or does. He is finishing the course, keeping the faith. And if you don't want to come along, well, that's just too bad. But there is a side of Paul that comes out in this letter that we should appreciate. Now, I don't know if he was this way naturally. I'm inclined to think that the disposition you see in his early days is really the person that he was deep down inside. But remember, it's like, according to Galatians, it's 14 years after his conversion before he goes back to Jerusalem and really begins what we think of as his ministry. He has had a long time to repent of the life that he led and to become the person that he is. So he still has the zeal and the passion, but Jesus has told him you're going to see how many things you're going to have to suffer for my sake. And it makes Paul into a different person. And he is a person that's concerned about other Christians. He is concerned about people that are new in the faith. He is concerned about where they're going to stand when the Lord comes again. And whether they are serving or not makes a big difference to him. And I just find that a kind of a fascinating transformation. And it's not something that I think we stop and think about very often. But it's just over and over as you go through this section. Begin reading with me. Let's start again in verse 1 of chapter 3. I know Wednesday night y'all covered the first several verses. But we want to pick up the context because the context doesn't change. Therefore, he says, when we could no longer endure it, just that in and of itself, we just couldn't stand it any longer, not knowing what was going on with you guys. When we could no longer endure it, we thought it good to be left in Athens alone and sent Timothy, our brother and minister of God, our fellow laborer in the gospel of Christ, to establish you and encourage you concerning your faith, that no one should be shaken by these afflictions. You yourselves know that we are appointed to this. For in fact, we told you before when we were with you that we would suffer tribulation, just as it happened, and you know. For this reason, when I could no longer endure it, I sent to know your faith, lest by some means the tempter had tempted you and our labor might be in vain. But now that Timothy has come to us from you and brought us good news of your faith and love, and that you always have a good remembrance of us, greatly desiring to see us, as we also to see you. Therefore, brethren, in all our affliction and distress, we were comforted concerning you by your faith. For now we live if you stand fast in the Lord. For what thanks can we render to God for you, for all the joy with which we rejoice for your sake before our God, night and day, praying exceedingly that we may see your face and perfect what is lacking in your faith. Now may our God and Father himself and our Lord Jesus Christ direct our way to you. May the Lord make you to increase and abound in love to one another and to all, just as we do to you, so that he may establish your hearts blameless in holiness before our God and the Father at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ with all of his saints. So it's kind of an interesting transition that you see in this man. And I think for all of us, it probably establishes, if you get nothing else out of this, just get the big picture that here's a man that once not only opposed God, but opposed God very passionately. I mean, he thought he was serving God, but he opposed Jesus very passionately, and was a man who did not seem to care too much about anybody else. All that mattered was, here's the standard that I'm upholding, and if you don't match up to it, then we're going to punish you and bring you into submission. And now, he's off in a city, and he is so concerned about these people that he's left behind that he's just agonizing over them. So much so that what becomes obvious in chapter 3 is that he's made some sacrifices to find out about their faith. I don't know all that y'all talked about Wednesday night, but if you go back to verse 2 where he talks about sending Timothy back, his description of Timothy, our brother, minister, fellow laborer, when you read the account back in Acts of Paul going from Thessalonica to Berea to Athens, Athens to Corinth, he first goes to Athens by himself, and then Timothy and Silas join him very quickly. But it's very clear in Paul's mind that he is so concerned about what's happened in the last few weeks or months, we don't really know how long he's been gone, that in spite of what's happening to Paul, he is concerned about these brethren that have been left behind in Thessalonica, and I think probably in Berea as well. We're not told that. I don't know if Paul wrote another letter to the Bereans. It would stand to reason. But he is very worried about these people, so much so that he's willing to suffer more to check on them. When he goes to Athens, we've made this point over and over, when he goes to Athens, things don't go very well as far as the reception of the gospel. And it appears when he first gets to Corinth that he is somewhat discouraged. And so he makes note here that he stays in Athens by himself, sends Timothy and Silas back. That was a big sacrifice for him. Any of you watch the Olympics opening ceremonies, the highlights from it? You've heard about them already. In some ways, it was cool. There were just some beautiful things around Paris that they showed, some really neat stuff. But in the midst of that was some of the most ungodly, indecent stuff that you can just ever imagine. And we look at that in our society, and buddy, it just scares us to death. I mean, social media has been blown up. I don't know how many texts I've gotten already. Just, hey, did you see this? What did you think of this? Imagine being in that world by yourself. I mean, we've got us. And when something shocks us or gets our attention, you know, we reach out to one another. Hey, did you see this? What did you think about it? Can you imagine? And we bemoan our circumstance with one another, don't we? Shake your head, yes. Okay? Imagine being in this environment that we find ourselves increasingly in and having no support. There's not anybody you pick up the phone and say, you know, I'm disheartened, I'm shocked, I'm frustrated, I'm angry. Because that's the way we react to this kind of stuff. And it helps sometimes just to have somebody that sympathizes with our position, somebody that you can kind of vent to. Paul goes to Athens. And he is there, and you can read Acts 17, and things don't go great while he's in Athens. He is arguing with the sophisticated philosophers of his day, and they're all looking down at him like he's just an intellectual midget. They call him a seed picker. Now, I don't know about Paul's background as far as his education, but it seems fairly clear to me that Paul was likely a very educated man. And my own suspicion is that Paul was probably a man of some means before he obeyed the gospel. And we know he's educated because we find him at times quoting Greek philosophers, quoting writers of the day. He does that on more than one occasion. And here he walks in and he's going to have a discussion with the intellectual giants of his day, the philosophical giants of his day, and they're all looking at him and making fun of him. And he knows that, I suspect, at least in intellectual ways, he's probably their equal. But he is preaching the gospel of Christ, and he is just meeting frustration, rejection. They're laughing at him. And there are only a few people that are willing to even consider it and embrace it. And at the end of the day, when you leave the Areopagus, and that's what you have dealt with, you go back to wherever you're staying, and the two guys that are with you, that are traveling with you, that you are working together, that you commiserate with, are not there. You've sent them back because you're so worried about these other Christians. I propose to you, we have no idea what life was like for Paul right then. Does that make sense to you? And so it's very tried in our minds, I think, when we read this. We thought it good to be left at Athens alone, and we sent Timothy, and we know that Silas went back as well, because when when you're reading Acts and you get to Acts, Paul being in Corinth in Acts chapter 18, Silas and Timothy come from Macedonia and meet him there. And what was life like for Paul? Not only waiting for them, but going from Athens and then to Corinth. And when he first gets to Corinth, things aren't really great there either. And you talk about feeling all by yourself in the midst of the Paris Olympic, opening ceremonies. That's kind of the way Paul had to feel. And so one of the things that we need to see, I think, in this first section is, we sent Timothy, our brother, our minister, our laborer, to establish you, to encourage you at great cost to ourselves, or at great cost to myself. I think that's there, we just don't see it. And it says a lot about the person that Paul was, and it says a lot about the relationship that Christians should have to one another. That he would make these kinds of sacrifices because he's concerned about his brethren and where they are. Verse 3 and 4, again, y'all have talked about this already. That no one would be shaken by these afflictions. Paul's worried about where their faith is going to go as a result of whatever persecution. You go back to chapter 2 and in verse 14, you became imitators of the churches in Judea. You suffered the same things from your own countrymen as they did from the Judeans. What had Christians in Judea suffered that we know about? What had Paul done to them? Thrown them in jail? Killed them? There's no reason to think that because Paul was arrested that some of that didn't still go on. We know Herod killed James. Okay, we know that at one point the apostles are the only ones that are there in Jerusalem. Things aren't good for Christians. I don't know what all's happened in Thessalonica. We're never really given great details, but whatever it is, he says, you're in the same boat that Christians in Judea were in the beginning of the gospel. And I think that that's probably more serious than we appreciate. And so Paul's concerned that they're not shaken by that. What does Paul not express concern about? Well, let's do it this way first. I kind of lead you where I'm going with that. What do you think their persecutions and their suffering entailed? What would you guess? Okay, financial. All right, financial. I think that's almost a given. Social. Once again, remember they had turned from idols to serve the true and living God. Did you think that their idol-worshiping friends are just going to continue to embrace them? So there's probably social repercussions. What else? Huh? Physical. Yeah, they very likely had been abused in some way physically if they are suffering the way the Judean brethren had. Somebody else said something over here a second ago. Okay, yeah. Think about the idea of just fear, of not knowing what's coming next. Am I going to lose more? Am I going to suffer more physically? Am I going to suffer more financially? The intimidation factor. And we have to remember these people lived in a much closer community than we do. On my street, I know most of the folks on our side of the circle. There's some really nice folks, but several of them stay very much to themselves, which is okay with me because I stay very much to myself. We all help each other. We all get along great. But, our lives are not intertwined. I don't rely on them for business or work or things. But in a city like Thessalonica, where people lived in closer quarters, everybody knew the grocer, everybody knew the shoemaker, everybody knew the candle maker, everybody knew who peddled the oil. I mean, it's a very tight knit. And you get up the next day, you don't know what you're going to face, and it had to be intimidating. Yeah, and their family, the threat to their family. Okay, now, my question a moment ago was, what does Paul worry about when he writes to them? You notice he doesn't say, hey, are you getting beat up? I'm worried whether you're getting beat up. He doesn't say, hey, do you need some money because, the brother of Philippi, they've been helping me and maybe we can work something out where they can... He doesn't ask about their social well-being. He's worried about whether or not they still trusted God. And what does that tell us about Paul? It tells us that his mindset was not temporal. It was spiritual, which is exactly what he writes so very often that he encourages us to develop. Does that mean we don't care about people in regards to what's happening in their physical lives? No, that's not the case at all. And it's obvious that Paul does care about those things. But those things don't matter any if you lose your faith. And so, verse 3, that no one would be shaken. And as y'all have already noted, I'm sure, he said, we told you this. Verse 4, we told you before. This is where y'all left off Wednesday. We told you before when we were with you that we would suffer tribulation, just as it happened and you know. And I don't think we there is just Paul and his companions, because they would have known what happened to Paul at Philippi. He makes that very clear. What he's saying is, we told you this is your lot as well. Paul tells Timothy, 2 Timothy chapter 3, all who live godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution. We are the exception to the rule historically, folks. And I often wonder, and I think ahead, I don't know how long the country's going to stand and how bad things are going to get, but I think of my kids, and now my granddaughter, and many of you have kids and grandchildren. What are they going to face, and are they going to stand up and be faithful if things get normal again? Because our life is not normal compared to the last 2,000 years for Christians. And we got to get the next generation ready for that. And so Paul's concern is, how's this suffering affect you? We told you it was coming. Verse 5 is interesting to me when he says, for this reason, when I couldn't endure it any longer, I just needed to know what was happening back in Thessalonica. That's how much you guys meant to me. I sent to know your faith, once again. Not, did somebody lose a leg? Okay, you got beat up. Do you still trust God? Lest by some means the tempter had tempted you and our labor might be in vain. Here's a point that I think needs to be made. We see it in the story of Job, although it's a little different. Don't dismiss what's happening around us as being a part of Satan's efforts to bring down God's people. He's always done this. We don't always see it identified in some of the Old Testament. You read through, if you were back in Devin's class right now, we were going through Kings, and this king and that king served the Lord, and this one didn't serve the Lord, and Ahab and Jezebel, and then Jehoshaphat. And we read about all these kings, and they were good and they were bad. And what God doesn't offer us in those records is, here's Satan behind the scenes doing this and doing that. But Satan was behind the scenes doing this and doing that, and that's what Paul says here. Our concern is whether or not Satan has used these things to tempt you in such a way that you have forsaken your faith. And once again, this is that spiritual perspective. So let me ask you, here's a good practical kind of application of this. When bad things happen in life, do you even consider the idea that Satan is in some way or another either behind it or using bad things as a temptation? If you don't think that way, you need to at least start thinking that way. Now, I'm not arguing that every bad thing that happens is Satan's doing. Okay, we really don't know how direct Satan is. With Judas, Satan entered his heart, and he, was a traitor to the Lord. With Peter, Jesus tells Peter, Satan has asked for you that he might sift you. So is what's happening to Peter when he's sitting around the fire at the trial, is that Satan sending people to him? I don't have any idea. Or is it just some girl sitting there and looks over and goes, hey, I've seen that guy before. Hey, weren't you with him? And without the prodding of Satan, because bad things happen. There's evil in this world. Sometimes Satan's behind it. Sometimes it's just chance and circumstance. Sometimes it's an ungodly person who hasn't been prompted. A lot of reasons bad things can happen. My question is, do we consider it from a spiritual standpoint that this is a temptation? Even if Satan's not the one instigating it, Satan can certainly use it. And I tell you, there's so many people in our academically advanced world that thinks that that is stupid, superstitious thinking that I think sometimes we're a little leery of saying, maybe Satan's behind what's happening to me. I laugh about this, and I've mentioned this before. When I was in college, I worked in a trailer hitch, a welding shop, and we custom-made trailer hitches, and we had a fellow that worked with us named Dick, and we called him Dickie. Dickie was about this tall. Funniest guy I ever saw, just sad. You look at his face, he's just sad sack. He had these big eyes. He was great. I really enjoyed him. He was a Christian. His dad was one of the elders of the congregation where I worshiped. And one day, Dickie was under a car drilling up some holes into the frame of the car in order to build this hitch that we were building. And the guy that was pulling the board, putting the pressure on it, he didn't hear it when the drill caught, and the drill caught, the bit caught, and it just threw Dickie out from under that car. I was standing there and watched him just slide all the way across the shop floor. And when he finished, he just kind of looked up like, what just happened? And his statement was, Scratch is after me today. And that was kind of his thing. Anything bad happens, Scratch is after me today. Well, it was funny, but at the same time, that very thought, even offered in humor, at least says, I recognize what's going on in my world, that there are forces for good and forces for evil working. We need that mentality. That's Paul's mentality. And that's his concern for these people. Phyllis? Don't you know it? Yeah. I think Paul's concerned a lot of times about his own suffering and how people are going to look at that, and how can this be a stamp of God's approval that all these bad things happen to you? Because most of us still think in terms of God blesses us when we're good, God curses us when we're bad. It's hard to get out of that mindset. And he's concerned. These people are suffering and they're new Christians. And don't you know what their idolatrous friends are saying? Well, how can this new stuff be true if you're suffering so bad? That's not a mark of God's approval. That's a mark of God's disdain. You've displeased the gods. And so Paul is fighting against that mentality. And it is just impressive what he went through and how much these people meant to him. Notice at the end of verse 5, not only lest the tempter had tempted you, but that our labor, what? Yeah, you think about Paul's whole life at this point is measured by people receiving the gospel of Jesus Christ. And here's a group of people that have become Christians, and now if they walk away because of their persecution, all the work, all the concern, all the effort, all the agony mentally that Paul was engaged in was, in his mind, for nothing. And I get that mentality. I really do. I understand how that can feel. And so, such is the point of the letter. But then you get to verse 6. But now Timothy has come to us from you, and he's brought us good news of your faith and love. Now, the faith part's pretty easy. You still trust God no matter about all these bad things that are happening to you. You're dealing with wicked people, difficult circumstances. You're suffering in one way or another, and you're still holding on. It's the love part in this verse that's the more impressive, though. Because love is this expression of seeing the needs of another before our own. And the most difficult time to think of somebody else is when things are hard for you, because you just tend to think about the stuff that's hard for you. You think about your own life. You think about your own circumstances. You know, even if it's not, oh, pitiful me, I'm going to go eat some worms, the idea that, how do I get through this? What do I need to do? How do I respond? That dominates our mind. And especially if it becomes financial, if it becomes social, you know, these things are a part of our day-to-day life. And yet, Paul says when Timothy came, he brought us good news about your love. That doesn't just mean your affection. It means you're thinking about other people and serving them. Remember back in chapter 1, we remember without ceasing your work of faith and labor of love. Okay, you're suffering, things are bad for you, but you're still watching out for one another. You're still helping others. You're still taking care of others. You're still showing your love. And that you always have good remembrance of us, greatly desiring to see us and we to see you. What an uplifting thing for Paul. And I think this application goes for all of us. This had to be an encouraging letter for the Thessalonians to get. It had to be an encouragement when Timothy showed up. And hey, Timothy, what are you doing here? Well, Paul was worried. He sent me back. What an encouragement to these people that Paul hadn't just gone off, you know, and forgotten about them. And now what an encouragement to Paul. That, hey, these folks, they can't appreciate you enough for what you have done. And they're still hard at it there. And that kind of give and take encouragement is important for us, folks. We all need it, don't we? And I'll tell you when it really shows up. Somebody gets sick, somebody's having a problem in their family, you have a little crisis of faith, you got a child, you got a parent, you got a brother or sister, maybe they're not coming to services, maybe their faith is waffling, maybe they're involved in something they shouldn't be. And what do we always do when somebody's sick or that there's an issue? What do we do with the local church? Always. Yeah, we ask for prayers, don't we? You know, I got a call this morning. George's mother has been ill, and she fell last night, and she's pretty sick this morning, and they had EMT there, and he didn't know as of 30, 45 minutes ago whether they were going to take her to the hospital or not. So what's the natural thing that we do? We reach out to our brethren and say, hey, I need you to pray for me. The question is, do we do that in reverse? Because it's easy when it's me to want my brethren to pray for me. It's not as easy when it's somebody else and their life is really focused upon some difficulty or challenge. And what I'm asked to do is I'm asked to take the time and show my love for them, to pray for them or reach out and help them. That's what makes a local congregation effective. When the give and the take is there. Not just the take. Not just the, hey, I need the prayers of the church, or, you know, I need the church to do this for me. It's got to be the, hey, what can I do to help everybody else part. And that's the part very often that's lacking in local congregations. That's the part that's lacking in this group from time to time. And so this is a point of self-examination as far as I'm concerned. Paul says, look, you know, we were thrilled that you care about what's happening to us just like we care about what's happening to you. Verse 7, so in all of our affliction and distress. You know, Paul's life's not easy while this is all going on. In all of our affliction and distress, we were comforted concerning you by your faith. Yeah, you're suffering persecution, but do you know what that has done for us? It's interesting when you read Acts 18 and Paul in Corinth, because one of the few times we have a record of God appearing to Paul while he's doing his missionary work is in Corinth. And what appears to be the case is Paul is discouraged, perhaps to the point of being afraid, because Jesus appears to him and tells him, don't be afraid, you keep it up. I've got a lot of people here. There's going to be a lot of people who obey the gospel here. So you don't quit. Well, you know, this is about the time Paul would have had Timothy and Silas show back up from Macedonia and write this letter. And what you see in in Corinth in Paul is just an almost 180. Suddenly he is on fire. How much of that being on fire is a result of Timothy coming back and saying, hey, here's what's going on in Thessalonica, and maybe Silas going, hey, here's what's going on in Berea. You know, we got run out of town pretty quick, but things are really going good there, and they are excited and they are thrilled. And now Paul is, you know, in all of our distress, and we were comforted concerning your faith. We live, he says, if you stand fast in the Lord. And in our independent society, man, there's you a mantra to adopt. I live if you're being faithful. We feel that way about our kids or our loved ones, don't we? We kind of live or die. If they're not being faithful, I don't know. There are quite a few of folks in this congregation who have children that aren't faithful. And I've talked to most of you, and you've talked to me, and I know what's going on in your life, and I know how agonizing that is. And it's like I had a person tell me not 6 months ago. I'm not sure that it would be better to be in hell with my children than to be in heaven without them. And I thought, I understand that, but buddy, that's brutal. And yet, such is our emotional attachment to the people we love. We know what it is to live based upon somebody else's faith. But how often do we do that with people that aren't our own family? With our spiritual family? You know, part of being a local congregation, and Paul's going to get to this in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, is support the weak, comfort the feeble-minded, be patient toward all brethren. This is an assignment he gives to the whole congregation. You know, how many people that are members of this congregation are presently very rarely seen here, and how many of us are concerned about that and working on that? Or do we just think that's the elder's job? And so this idea of we live if you stand fast in the Lord, there's you something for all of us to work on. So verse 9, what thanks can we render to God? This is kind of how he ends the chapter. How do I thank God enough for all the joy that we rejoice for your sake before our God? Look at what you have done to us. Look at how you have encouraged us. We are hard at it once again because we have found out that you are faithful night and day, praying exceedingly that we may see your face and perfect what is lacking. Paul understands they're spiritually not mature yet, but at the same time, that they are, if they're not doing anything else, they are encouraging Paul and Timothy and Silas in their work, and Paul can't wait to get back to them so he can further his work, so he can help them even more because they're helping him. What a wonderful picture of the way it ought to be between God's people and one another, and especially between God's people and those who are ministers to God's people. Questions, comments at this point? Anybody? I feel like I'm preaching this morning for some reason. Yes, Suzanne? Oh, I have no doubt. Sure. Yeah. Well, I think it's fairly clear in some passages. You look at Acts chapter 18. You look at 2 Corinthians chapter 1. Paul talks about receiving comfort in his affliction so that he can express comfort to other people. 2 Corinthians 11, he talks about the thorn in his flesh that he begged God. I don't know what his thorn in the flesh was. My own thinking is that it may have had something to do with his eyes. That there is a disfiguring eye disease that there's just 2 or 3 things scattered throughout Paul's writings that make me wonder about that. And he felt like it was a deterrent to his work. And he begs God. And God says, no, the grace that I have shown you is sufficient for you. And Paul's, obviously, I mean, there's some physical something that he calls a thorn in the flesh, which means, you ever had a thorn in the flesh? It just aggravates at you constantly, and you can't get rid of it. And so does Paul, is he ever discouraged? Does he ever suffer? Yeah, there's no question. How can you go through all he did and never suffer? So what we don't appreciate is, this is the stuff in some ways that kept Paul going, is other people that are being faithful. So it's a great thought. But yeah, I think Paul probably struggled like we all do from time to time. You know, it's easy to put Paul on this big pedestal up here, and that's where I've got him. I really do. I think of Peter as the one that's just struggling all the time. I'm sure Paul was the same. So those are good observations. Anybody else? Okay, so he ends this chapter with a prayer, okay? May our God and Father himself and our Lord Jesus Christ direct our way to you. It is fairly clear from time to time that Paul doesn't get to do some of the things that he wants to do. He tells the Corinthians he had tried to get back to them a time or two. When he writes the letter to the Romans, he makes a defense at the very end of Romans about why he had never been there, even though he had planned to be there a time or two. And even to the Thessalonians, if you go back to chapter 2 and verse 17, we, brethren, having been taken away from you for a short time in present, not in heart, endeavored more eagerly to see your face with great desire. And we wanted to come to you, even I, Paul, time and again, but Satan hindered us. I have no idea what it was that hindered him. You know, when he got run out of town, when the brethren had gotten him out of town and Jason had paid some kind of security, did that entail that, okay, we're going to make an agreement that we won't bring Paul back to town? I think that's possible. It may be things that are going on financially. Maybe whatever difficulty he's having in Athens and in Corinth prevented Paul from, we just really don't know. But in Paul's mind, he wasn't able to go back because Satan hindered him. And so his prayer in verse 11 is, we really want to come back. Just the fact that we haven't been back yet doesn't mean that we don't care about you folks and what's going on. We're trying, and we're praying to God that he would direct our way to you. And not only that, verse 12, but that the Lord would make you increase and abound in love to one another and to all just as we do, so that he may establish your hearts blameless in holiness at his coming. Which is a really interesting kind of prayer that Paul offers. If I were to ask you, what's the key to you standing blameless before God at his coming? When the Lord comes to judge, in your mind, what's going to be the key in your life that you stand before him justified? Yeah, faith, I think, is generally the answer that pops in. This answer pops in my mind. I am not going to lose my trust in God. I might not always, I may fall from time to time, but it's not going to be because I have forsaken my trust in God. But what Paul prays for is not their faith, but what? What does he say is that the Lord's going to use to measure them as blameless in holiness? Their love for one another, which is interesting to me. Okay? And so the question is, why is it that their love for one another is going to be the thing, he says, that's going to establish their hearts blameless in the eyes of God? Well, why do you love each other as children of God? I know he says that. My question is why? Say it again, Ken. Because Jesus loved us. Our love for one another, the great commandment is love the Lord your God, right? Second is likened to it, love your neighbor as yourself. Why do you do all that? Because of your faith. Because the way faith really expresses itself, we see what Jesus has done, we see what God has done, we trust that so much that it changes the way we live our lives. That we love each other and we love all men. There is such a thing as being philanthropic, of loving humanity without faith in God. But real faith in God always expresses itself in love. And so what's the greatest test? Well, the greatest test is our love for one another. Was that the second bell? I'm sorry. I've been waiting for the second bell to ring here, so I'm just moving along. We'll pick up with those thoughts. No Wednesday singing. Next Sunday. Okay? Thank you, guys. Sorry, I thought we were still waiting on the second bell.